Hey guys, welcome to the Chapter 5 lecture. So Chapter 5 is all about chemical reactions. And when chemical reactions occur, a lot of times heat is transferred. And so the study of the heat transfer during a chemical reaction is called thermodynamics. We can also study the speed of chemical reactions. This is called kinetics. And we can also classify different types of chemical reactions. And we'll talk about some of those different categories and some of those specific chemical reactions in this chapter. So what's happening in a chemical reaction on the atomic level? Well, chemical reactions involve breaking bonds and then forming new bonds. So the collision theory of chemical reactions is this idea that atoms or molecules are flying around at high speeds, and if they crash into each other hard enough and in the correct orientation, then bonds will be broken and new bonds will be formed and a chemical reaction occurs. So that's what's shown in this picture here. In the first scenario, the molecules hit each other but not hard enough, and so they just bounce off. In the second reaction, the molecules crash hard enough, but they're not in the right orientation. The carbon is not hitting the oxygen on the NO3 molecule. And then in the bottom one, though, they hit both hard enough and in the correct orientation for bonds to break in the first molecule and to reform. Hey guys, welcome to the Chapter 5 lecture. So Chapter 5 is all about chemical reactions. And when chemical reactions occur, a lot of times heat is transferred. And so the study of the heat transfer during a chemical reaction is called thermodynamics. We can also study the speed of chemical reactions. This is called kinetics. And we can also classify different types of chemical reactions. And we'll talk about some of those different categories and some of those specific chemical reactions in this chapter. So what's happening in a chemical reaction on the atomic level? Well, chemical reactions involve breaking bonds and then forming new bonds. So the collision theory of chemical reactions is this idea that atoms or molecules are flying around at high speeds, and if they crash into each other hard enough and in the correct orientation, then bonds will be broken and new bonds will be formed and a chemical reaction occurs. So that's what's shown in this picture here. In the first scenario, the molecules hit each other but not hard enough, and so they just bounce off. In the second reaction, the molecules crash hard enough, but they're not in the right orientation. The carbon is not hitting the oxygen on the NO3 molecule. And then in the bottom one, though, they hit both hard enough and in the correct orientation for bonds to break in the first molecule and to reform in the second molecule. So the CO becomes CO2. So this energy that it takes to collide reactants in order for a reaction to occur is called the activation energy. So all reactions require activation energy to go, but that breaking and forming of bonds also involves a change of energy from reactant to product. So breaking bonds requires energy, and forming bonds actually releases energy. And so we can measure the amount of energy that is used and released and quantify that, and we call it the heat of the reaction, or it's written delta H. That triangle is the Greek letter delta. So if the delta value is negative, that means that there's more energy released than there was required to break the bonds. And so we call that an exothermic reaction. If the delta H value, or the heat of reaction, is positive, that means that a lot of energy was needed to break bonds, not a lot of energy was released in the forming of bonds. So overall, there was energy absorbed by the reaction, and we call that an endothermic reaction. Endo means within, so it's taking in energy, and exo means without, or out of. And so in an exothermic reaction, energy is coming out of it. So we can look at these endothermic and exothermic reactions. This slide is a little contradictory. It says exothermic at the top, but we're actually talking about endothermic reactions here. So in an endothermic reaction, heat is the reactant, is one way you can think of it. Heat is put into the reaction. It's endothermic. It absorbs heat. So we can almost write heat in the equation, the chemical equation, as a reactant. A good example of an endothermic reaction are instant cold packs. They feel cold because they're actually drawing heat, absorbing heat from your skin, and you feel that sensation as coldness. We can also graph the energy of a reaction and as it changes over the course of a reaction. So in this chart here, in this graph that's pictured, energy is on the y-axis and the progress of the reaction, or time, is on the x-axis. And at the start of the reaction, all we have is reactants. And then remember, we have to put energy in to get the reaction to go. We have to get the molecules colliding hard enough and in the correct orientation to make the reaction happen. So that activation energy is that big hill that you have to go up. And that red arrow represents the difference between the energy of the reactants and the energy of that top energy state called the transition state. So that's the activation energy. And then the reaction starts to proceed and products are formed. So at the end of the reaction, you are left with products. In this case, the products are higher in energy than the reactants. In other words, it took a lot of energy to break those reactant bonds, but you didn't release a lot of energy in the formation of products. So the overall change in energy, the difference from the energy in the reactants up to that energy of the products, is positive. That delta H, the green arrow, goes up. All right, it's an overall uphill diagram. So that's what an endothermic energy diagram looks like. It's always going to have this overall uphill shape. Exothermic reactions are the opposite. In exothermic reactions, heat is produced, so it's almost like it's a product, and so you can even write it on the product side of the equation. An example are instant hot packs or heat packs that you use like hand warmers, which is just this reaction here, which is actually just oxygen rusting. Just does it very fast in these little bags, and that's an exothermic reaction. Heat is released and you feel that heat. The energy diagram for an exothermic reaction is going to be the opposite of endothermic. So it's an overall downhill sort of curve. The reactants are higher in energy than the products, so that delta H, the change in the heat or the heat of the reaction, is negative. The change in energy, the energy is going down over the course of the reaction. Notice though, it still requires an activation energy. It still requires, there's still a little bit of an uphill, and that red arrow represents the amount of energy that you have to put in to get the reaction to go. So this slide is just to alert you to some slight differences in wording of your textbook versus my lecture notes. So I like to use the terms exothermic and endothermic because I just am talking about heat. In the study of thermodynamics, there are other measures of energy, not just heat energy, but other types of energy. And I don't want to get into that in this level. And for some reason, the textbook does a little bit. So you're going to see these terms exergonic and endergonic instead of exothermic and endothermic. So for all intents and purposes, they are the same. So if you see exothermic or exergonic, same meaning. Endothermic, endergonic, same meaning. Also, your textbook uses delta G instead of delta H. So it's free energy versus the heat of the reaction. So again, if a problem in the homework mentions delta G, which I don't think it does, treat it as if it's delta H, or the heat of the reaction, because they're virtually very similar. So on this slide is just a quick sample problem that's asking you which of the following reaction energy diagrams is an exergonic or exothermic reaction, and which one is the endergonic or endothermic reaction. Maybe pause here and take a minute and try to solve it yourself. But otherwise I'll go ahead and tell you the answer. The exergonic reaction is going to be the one that is releasing energy and is overall downhill, and the endothermic or endergonic one is going to be the one that is overall an uphill. So the first one is the endothermic or endergonic reaction, and the second one is the exothermic or exergonic reaction. It also asks you which of these is faster. We haven't talked about this yet, but if we look at the activation energy for each of these, the activation energy, or that uphill that the first reaction diagram A has to go through, is very large, whereas the uphill, or the activation energy for diagram B, is very small. So if you think of yourself as like a little person on a bike at the start of each of these reactions, which one are you going to be able to, reaction diagram will you be able to bike through faster? And of course it'll be the one with the smaller uphill. And that's true of chemical reactions as well. The smaller the activation energy, the faster the reaction is. So activation energy is also important because it determines the speed of the reaction. And the study of the speed or rate of chemical reactions is called reaction kinetics. So in this diagram here, it's just showing you two different reactions. The one in blue has a lower slope, all right? The one in red has a steeper slope. The steeper slope indicates that more product is being made in a short amount of time. They both taper off at the same point, but the red reaction reaches that point faster than the blue reaction. So we would say the red reaction is faster, it has faster kinetics. So there are a few different things that can affect the rate of a chemical reaction. Three important ones are temperature, concentration or amount of reactant, and catalysts. So if you increase the temperature, this is going to increase the speed of the particles. They're going to fly around faster, which is going to increase the likelihood that they're going to have collisions and that those collisions will be hard enough to meet that activation energy. Adding more reactant just makes the contents of the reaction particle more crowded. So again, the more crowded that space is, the more particles that are there, then again, the higher the likelihood they're going to crash into each other and a chemical reaction will occur. Catalysts are kind of like matchmakers. They are substances that basically bring the reactants together so that a chemical reaction can occur. They lower the activation energy because they don't have to, the reactants don't have to wait to randomly bump into each other for the chemical reaction to occur. The other important thing about catalysts is they are not changed in the reaction. So their composition doesn't change even though the reactants turn into products. So the way catalysts work from an energy perspective is they lower the activation energy. So they make it easier to get over that hump because they make the hump smaller. So in this diagram here, in the graph, you can see a reaction energy diagram in red for a given reaction, but when you add the catalyst, the activation energy goes down. In other words, there's a smaller hill that has to be gotten over in order for the reaction to go. Another way of saying that is that the catalyst provides an easier path for the reactants to become products. In chemistry, like in a chemistry lab, catalysts are often metals, but in biology, in cells and in organisms, catalysts are enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that speed up chemical reactions. So the basic anatomy of an enzyme is the enzyme itself, this orange cartoon here, is made of protein. And it has a specific site that reactants can bind to. And those binding sites are called the active site. So the reactants in the chemical reaction bind to the active site of the enzyme. And enzymes are very specifically shaped for those reactants to fit there. And then they catalyze the chemical reaction and the products leave. So we'll learn more about enzymes in a few more chapters. So now let's talk about some specific chemical reactions. The first one being combustion. Combustion reactions happen around us all of the time. Anytime something's on fire, that's a combustion reaction. When you drive your car and you're burning fuel, that's a combustion reaction. When you eat food and your body's breaking down glucose to make ATP, energy for your cells, that's a combustion reaction technically. So the definition of a combustion reaction is it's just any carbon-containing molecule, any organic compound, that reacts with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water and heat. Combustion reactions are all exothermic reactions. All right, so in the example with the car, octane, C8H18, is a carbon-containing molecule, and it reacts with oxygen, and it produces water and carbon dioxide and energy. The carbon dioxide comes out of your tailpipe, so does the water as steam, and the energy is used to power your car. In metabolism or indigestion, your body is breaking down, your cells really are taking in glucose and they're combining it with oxygen, and they are again producing carbon dioxide as a byproduct, which is why you need to breathe in oxygen for this process and you breathe out carbon dioxide. And you also produce a little bit of water in the process, which your body uses, and of course energy. So alkanes are really a great source of the combustible materials, and we use a lot of alkanes in fuel. Octane in our gas tank, and butane is the fuel that's in lighters, like a cigarette lighter, and propane, which you might use on your stove. All right, so alkanes are very popular combustion fuels, and they are what are known as fossil fuels. They basically are products of breakdown of organic substances over years and years and years, which is why they're called fossil fuels. So a lot of combustion engines do not burn these alkanes completely, and you don't get just water and carbon dioxide as a product. You also get carbon, pure carbon, and other byproducts that are dirty and that are pollutants, which is why when you some cars you see black smoke coming out of the tailpipe. That's soot, that's carbon, solid carbon dust from incomplete combustion. So clean burning fuels, what they mean is they are more completely combusted. So this sample problem is giving you the starting reactants for a combustion problem, or a combustion reaction, and it's asking you to complete the reaction, so write out the products, and also to balance it. So the first step is to finish the reaction, to complete it. And we know that in combustion reactions, the products are always carbon dioxide and water. So we write H2O and CO2. Now we balance it. We have the correct products there. We're going to write water and carbon dioxide. Now we balance it. So we make a list of atoms. We've got carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We tally up the number on each side. So there's 3 carbons, 8 hydrogens, and 2 oxygens on the reactant side. 1 carbon, 2 hydrogens, and 3 oxygens on the product side. There's 1 oxygen in water and 2 oxygens in carbon dioxide. And now we're going to start balancing. I'm just going to start with carbon. It's at the top of the list. So if I put a 3 in front of CO2, then I have 3 carbons. And I've also changed the number of oxygens. I have 3 times 2 for a total of 6, plus the 1 in the water, which makes it 7. Don't forget to count the oxygens in both molecules. So now I'm going to go next on the list is hydrogen. So if I put a 4 in front of water, H2O, then I have 4 times 2, which is 8 hydrogens. And now my hydrogens are balanced. And lastly, I will do the, by putting a 4 in front of the water, I increase the number of hydrogens, but I also change the number of oxygens. So now I have 4 oxygens plus 6 oxygens for a total of 10 oxygens on the product side. Now all I have left is the oxygen. I need to have 10 oxygens on the reactant side, so if I multiply that by 5, 5 times 2 is 10. And now it is a balanced combustion reaction. So the key there is step 1, write out the products, and the combustion products are always carbon dioxide and water. Step 2, balance the equation. Another type of chemical reaction that's very prevalent in biological systems are oxidation and reduction reactions, or collectively they're called redox reactions. Now, redox reactions always involve the transfer of electrons. One molecule loses electrons, another molecule gains those electrons. But how we can identify it based on the chemical reaction looks a little bit different when we have inorganic molecules versus organic molecules. And we'll see that, but this is like sort of a cheat slide with the rules that you can refer to as you're doing these practice problems. A common mnemonic used to remember what happens during redox reactions is oil rig. Oil stands for oxidation is loss of electrons, and rig stands for reduction is gain of electrons. Now, redox reactions are like the bane of all chemistry students because they're so backward sounding. Reduction is gain. That's so backwards. Reduction means to go down, not to go up like gain. So it's very counterintuitive. But the reason reduction is gain is because you're gaining electrons, and that causes a reduction of the charge because electrons are negatively charged. So if you gain something negative, you actually become more negative. Your charge goes down. So that's why it has this confusing name of reduction, even though it's actually gaining electrons. It's losing charge. So this diagram sort of shows that. The orange molecule is donating or giving away an electron. It's losing an electron, so it's getting oxidized. And the red molecule is gaining that electron, so it's getting reduced. So let's practice this. Rusting is a great example of an inorganic redox reaction. When iron rusts, it reacts with oxygen, and it forms iron oxide, this compound here. That is the compound of rust. So iron as an atom, pure solid iron is just atomic iron. It is not charged. It has no charge. Same thing with oxygen, the covalent compound, oxygen gas. It has no charge, all right? But iron oxide is a compound that's made of a metal and a nonmetal. It's an ionic compound, and by definition, ionic compounds are made of ions. So even though this compound is neutral, we know from previous chapters that it's actually made up of two charged particles, or types of charged particles. And so we have to figure out what the charges are on them. Oxygen is always a -2 charge. We know that by looking at the periodic table. It's a group 6 element, so it's going to gain 2 electrons and have a -2 charge to fill its valence shell. Iron must, in this case, have a 3+ charge because it takes 2 of them to balance out 3 oxygen atoms. So if we look at this progress of the reaction, that iron on the reactant side had a 0 charge, but on the product side it had a 3+ charge as part of this ionic compound. So its charge went up, all right, that's because it lost electrons, and that would mean that it got oxidized. The oxygen, on the other hand, had a 0 charge on the reactant side, but on the product side had a 2- charge. Its charge was reduced, so it was the reduced element. All right, so if you remember that reduction is always the reduction of charge, then that will help you identify. So I usually try to identify the reduced agent first, and then the other thing is the one that got oxidized. So if the charge goes down, it got reduced, and it got reduced because it gained electrons, which are negative. I know, it's super confusing. An important example of inorganic redox reactions that happen in biological cells is the one that's pictured here. So this is a picture of the electron transport chain, which is the machinery in your cells that make ATP, cellular energy. And you can see there's all these different complexes, protein complexes, but there's one called cytochrome C that binds to an iron ion. And as this machinery is called the electron transport chain, it's literally transporting electrons through a series of oxidation and reduction reactions. And so iron gets oxidized and reduced as electrons get passed through this chain. So in this sample problem, it asks you to determine which of the reactants is undergoing oxidation and which is undergoing reduction. We know this is an inorganic reaction because there's no carbon around. So we're talking inorganic redox reaction here. So the calcium, the solid calcium, that's pure metallic calcium. It is atomic. It does not have a charge. All right. Sulfur in its pure solid state also is not ionic. It does not have a charge. But when we take calcium, a metal, and sulfur, a nonmetal, and we combine them, we get an ionic compound. Electrons are transferred, and the atoms become ions. They become charged. Now, calcium, if you look at your periodic table, is a group 2 element, so it has 2 valence electrons that it loses, so it has a 2+ charge. when it's an ion, and sulfur is over in group 6, and it's going to gain 2 electrons and have a 2- charge. So we know that looking at our periodic table. So first thing I want to do is I'm going to identify the thing that gets reduced. The one that's charge goes down over the course of the reaction. Sulfur starts out at 0, and its charge at the end is -2, so its charge is reduced. In other words, it's the one that got reduced, that underwent reduction, and it gained electrons. The other one, the calcium, its charge went up, it was oxidized. It lost electrons, and that made it more positive, okay? So in organic redox reactions, carbon-containing molecules, it's harder to count electrons because these are covalent compounds. There's not transfer of electrons. It's not made of charged particles. So a different way to sort of categorize or to identify redox reactions in organic molecules is by counting oxygens or hydrogens. Oxidation is called oxidation because it usually involves the adding of oxygen. So oxidation is either gain of oxygen or loss of hydrogen, and reduction is loss of oxygen or gain of hydrogen. All right, so in this reaction here, it's showing you in the center an aldehyde functional group, which is a C double bonded to an O and single bonded to an H, a hydrogen. When it's reduced, hydrogens are added. And so now we went from having 1 hydrogen to 3 hydrogens. If we follow the right arrow, the reduction arrow. The left arrow shows oxidation, in this case, not removing hydrogens, but adding oxygens. We went from 1 oxygen to 2 oxygens. So by doing oxidation and reduction reactions, we can change the functional groups on organic compounds. We can go from an aldehyde to an alcohol or a carboxylic acid, and that changes the chemistry of the molecule. So in this sample problem, it's just asking you to look at this reaction and indicate, is this organic reactant undergoing oxidation or reduction? These are two, molecules, but the part of the molecule that we care about is the part that's different between them. So they both have a benzene ring that we can ignore. We're looking at the part in the red boxes. That's what's changing. So in the reactant side, we notice that this functional group has 1 hydrogen and 2 oxygens, and in the product side, it has 3 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So it both gained hydrogen and lost oxygen. That is reduction. It's losing oxygen, it's reducing the amount of oxygen. So it's getting reduced. So oxidation is really important in cells. It's important for metabolism. So although we talked about this reaction being a combustion reaction, it's also technically an oxidation reaction. You're adding oxygen, okay? But oxygen can also be a very dangerous molecule because oxygen can form these very reactive species called radicals or free radicals, and those can damage cells. So when you hear people talk about antioxidants and why antioxidants are important is they help to neutralize those oxygen-free radicals. So oxygen is both vital for life, you have to breathe it in order to make energy, but it's also kind of slowly killing you because it's forming free radicals that can damage your cells and your DNA and lead to things like aging and cancer and yada yada. Another type of important category of chemical reaction, so just to recap, we've talked about combustion reactions and redox reactions. The last type of reactions I really want you to know are these condensation and hydrolysis reactions. And those terms, condensation and hydrolysis, should make you think of water. Both of these reactions involve water. So in a condensation reaction, water is produced. It's on the product side of the reaction. And condensation reactions are synthesis reactions. So they're used to build things, to take 2 small molecules and form a larger molecule. Hydrolysis reactions use water as a reactant. So hydrolysis literally means to break water. So it's taking water as a reactant, breaking it, and basically plopping it onto 2 different molecules. Hydrolysis reactions are breakdown reactions. They take a larger thing and break it down into 2 or more smaller things. A classic example of a condensation reaction in cells is the reaction that ATP undergoes when it's producing energy. So ATP is the energy molecule that cells use. It's pictured here, it's kind of complex, but you can see in this reaction when you combine it with water and you do a hydrolysis reaction, you break off one of the phosphate groups of the ATP. So you've lost this phosphate group, and that reaction is extremely exothermic. It releases a lot of energy, and then the cell can use that energy to do work, to contract muscles or to fuel endothermic chemical reactions. So that is how ATP is used. For energy, it's actually undergoing hydrolysis, and the hydrolysis of ATP is very, very exothermic. Another reaction type that I'm just going to go over is phosphorylation and dephosphorylation. So this is adding a phosphate group, which is often pictured in a cartoon way as just a P with a circle. So ATP has 3 of these phosphate groups. And so ATP, while we use it for energy, we can also use it and harvest those phosphate groups. So phosphate groups can be added to enzymes to basically turn them on or off. You don't need all your enzymes on all the time. It's like having all the lights on in your house when you're not there. It's a waste of energy. And so we can turn enzymes off, just like you turn off the lights in your house, or maybe you turn off your computer when you're not using it, or you turn off your TV. Because if you're not there to use it, it's a waste of energy. So phosphorylating enzymes is a way to turn them on or off. And then, of course, dephosphorylating to reverse that reaction. So let's go back to condensation and hydrolysis reactions. So sample problem here. In this first one, is it condensation or hydrolysis? Well, let's see. We've got some cartoonish molecule plus water on the reactant side. So that's a clue there. Water is a reactant. And another clue is that we have this large cartoon molecule on the left, and we have 2 smaller cartoony molecules on the right. So it's a breakdown reaction that involves water as a reactant. That's hydrolysis. This reaction here, we've got 2 cartoony molecules on the left on the reactant side, and 1 cartoony molecule. We've combined those 2 things together. On the product side, also on the product side, is water. So this is a reaction where 2 things are combining into 1 and also forming water. That is the definition of a condensation reaction. So again, hydrolysis reactions are breakdown reactions, and condensation are build up or synthesis reactions. Chemical reactions can also be grouped into general categories, either a synthesis reaction, a decomposition reaction, or an exchange reaction. Synthesis reactions are build up. So you take smaller things and you combine them to make bigger things. So a classic example is amino acids, linking them together to build a protein. Decomposition reactions are breakdown reactions. You're taking some compound or molecule and you're breaking it up into smaller molecules. For example, starch in food is a type of carbohydrate. When you digest it, you break it down into individual glucose molecules. So that's a decomposition reaction. Exchange reactions involve swapping of atoms in molecules. So there's single displacement and double displacement. And I have a little analogy I like to use for exchange reactions that has to do with, I guess, dating. So single displacement I call the homewrecker reaction. Because it's like you have a happy couple and then a homewrecker comes along and runs off with one of the partners. And then now you have a new couple and a new single person. So there's been some swapping there. In a double displacement, I call that the swinger reaction. So swingers are like couples that swap partners. So if you look at these molecules here, HCl is one compound that contains hydrogen and chlorine, and then MgOH2, magnesium hydroxide, contains a magnesium and these hydroxide OH particles. Well, they swap. So the hydrogen and the chlorine and the magnesium go together, and the hydrogen from the HCl pairs up with the hydroxides from the MgOH2 and forms water. So you get this swapping of cations and anions. They swap partners. So that's a double displacement. In this sample problem, it asks you to categorize the following reactions as synthesis, decomposition, or exchange reactions. Pause the video here so you can try it on your own before viewing the answers. The first one is an exchange. Basically, iron leaves oxygen, and oxygen and carbon pair up. In the second one, it's a decomposition reaction because the compound breaks up into elements. And in the third one, it's a synthesis reaction because two elements come together and react to form a compound. So far, when we've talked about chemical reactions, we've drawn a one-way reaction arrow. That indicates that the reaction only goes in one direction and is irreversible. So, for example, combustion of gasoline in your car is an irreversible reaction. You can't get the gas back after you've burned it. You have to keep filling up. But in biology, most reactions are actually reversible reactions. They can go in both directions. So the reactants that combine to form a product can also be broken down back into those reactants. So we indicate reversible reactions by drawing a two-way arrow. And we'll see the importance of these reversible reactions later in the class when we talk about equilibrium. That's all for Chapter 5. Thanks for watching.